a land older than its name. America did not begin in 1776. Long before a single European sail appeared on the Atlantic horizon, this continent was alive, breathing, trading, building, arguing, praying. The story of the United States does not start with a declaration or a revolution. It starts with ice. During the last ice age, a land bridge connected what is now Russia to Alaska. Across this frozen corridor, the first people walked. They were following animals, chasing survival, with no idea they were making history. Slowly, over thousands of years, their descendants spread across two continents, filling every climate from frozen tundra to scorching desert, developing hundreds of languages, religions, and ways of life. By the time Europeans arrived, this was not an empty wilderness. It was a world. In the Mississippi Valley, cities rose. Ceremonial mounds, some larger than Egyptian pyramids, marked the skylines. In the Southwest, the Pueblo people carved multi-story apartment complexes directly into cliff faces. In the Northeast, 5 nations, the Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, Oneida, and Seneca, set aside their differences and formed the Iroquois Confederacy, a functioning democratic government with elected representatives, centuries before Philadelphia existed. Then, from across the ocean, everything changed. The collision of worlds. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west from Spain with 3 ships and a dangerously wrong map. He was looking for Asia. He found the Bahamas. He died believing he had reached the outskirts of India, which is why the people already living here were called Indians, a name that stuck through sheer historical stubbornness. Columbus made 4 voyages and was appointed governor of Hispaniola. He was also, by any honest account, a man capable of extraordinary brutality. He enslaved and massacred indigenous populations on a scale that shocked even some of his contemporaries. He was eventually arrested and brought back to Spain in chains, not for the massacres, but for mismanaging the colony's finances. The deeper catastrophe, however, was invisible. European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, tore through populations that had never encountered them. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died within a century of first contact. Entire civilizations, languages, and histories vanished, not through conquest alone, but through biology. A continent for sale. The Europeans came in waves. The Spanish pushed through Florida and the Caribbean, then dismantled the Aztec and Inca empires with a combination of steel, disease, and ruthless political cunning. The French followed the rivers inland, building a fur-trading empire called New France that stretched from Quebec to Louisiana. The Dutch established a profitable colony called New Netherland along the Hudson River, a territory so strategically valuable that the English eventually took it by force during a war and renamed its capital city. They called it New York. The English, for their part, planted 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast. The first permanent settlement was Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607, which survived, barely, by growing tobacco. As the tobacco economy expanded, it devoured labor. Indentured servants came first, working off their passage in years of plantation labor. But indentured servitude had a time limit. Slavery did not. By the mid-17th century, European ships were sailing to West Africa, trading goods for human beings, and carrying those human beings across the Atlantic under conditions so brutal that many did not survive the voyage. Those who did were forced to work without pay, without rights, and without hope of freedom. This was the architecture on which the Southern economy was built, and the wound that would not heal for centuries. The spark of revolution. By the mid-18th century, Britain and France were locked in a global struggle for dominance. In North America, this erupted into the French and Indian War in 1754, fought over the fertile Ohio River Valley. Britain won, But the victory came at enormous financial cost. To recover those costs, Parliament turned to the colonies, and the colonies turned furious. Tax after tax arrived from London. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, taxes on tea, glass, lead, and paper. The colonists had no representatives in Parliament, and their frustration crystallized into a slogan that echoed through every tavern and town square: no taxation without representation. Protests escalated. In 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd of stone-throwing protesters in Boston, killing 5. The colonists called it a massacre. In 1773, a group of patriots disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of tea into the water. The British response, sending troops, suspending local government, closing the port, only hardened colonial resistance. On the night of April 18, 1775, a silversmith named Paul Revere rode through the Massachusetts countryside, warning that British regulars were marching. The following morning, at Lexington and Concord, American militiamen stood their ground. The Revolutionary War had begun. A nation declares itself. The Continental Congress appointed a Virginia planter and surveyor named George Washington to command the Continental Army. Washington was not the most brilliant military mind of his era. He lost more battles than he won, but he had something more valuable than tactical genius. He refused to quit. On July 4, 1776, the Congress approved a document written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, a document that opened with a sentence that has reverberated through history ever since. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The Declaration of Independence was radical, visionary, and deeply hypocritical. Jefferson enslaved over 600 people during his lifetime. The contradiction was not lost on contemporary observers, nor on the enslaved people themselves, but it was left, deliberately, for future generations to resolve. The war itself might have been lost were it not for France. The American victory at Saratoga in 1777 convinced the French that the rebels could actually win, and France entered the war officially, providing troops, ships, and money. With French assistance, Washington trapped the main British army at Yorktown, Virginia, in 1781. The British surrendered. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, recognized American independence. Growing pains. The new nation was a fragile experiment. Its first attempt at a national government, the Articles of Confederation, was so weak it could barely collect taxes or raise an army. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia and drafted the Constitution, a document that created a federal government strong enough to function, divided into 3 branches to prevent any one of them from dominating, and built on the radical idea that power flowed upward from the people. George Washington became the first president in 1789. He served 2 terms and then, in a gesture that would prove foundational to American democracy, voluntarily stepped down, demonstrating that in this new republic, power could be transferred peacefully. The country grew. Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon in 1803, roughly doubling the size of the United States for $15 million, and sent Lewis and Clark to explore it. The expedition returned with maps, specimens, and journals documenting a continent of staggering scale and variety. Growth also meant conflict. The War of 1812 ended in a draw, but confirmed American independence. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced entire native nations from their ancestral homelands at gunpoint. A forced march through winter and disease that killed thousands and became known, with quiet horror, as the Trail of Tears. And growth meant expansion. Under the doctrine of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to stretch from sea to sea, the country annexed Texas in 1845, fought Mexico for California and the Southwest, and settled a border dispute with Britain that fixed the US-Canada line at the 49th parallel. When gold was discovered in California in 1848, 300,000 people descended on the territory within 2 years. The gold rush transformed California from a frontier backwater into a state almost overnight. A nation tears itself apart. But beneath every westward expansion lay a single, poisonous question. Would the new territories be slave or free? The South's economy was built on enslaved labor. The North was industrializing rapidly and no longer needed it. As each new territory applied for statehood, the question forced itself onto the national stage. Compromise after compromise collapsed. Tempers hardened into ideology. When Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 presidential election, the South panicked, not because Lincoln planned to abolish slavery where it existed, but because they feared the direction he represented. South Carolina seceded, then Georgia, then Mississippi, then 5 more. The Confederate States of America was born, and when Confederate artillery shelled the federal garrison at Fort Sumter in April 1861, the Civil War began. The Union had the factories, the railways, the population, and the Navy. The Confederacy had extraordinary generals, Robert E. Lee above all, and the fierce motivation of men fighting on home ground. The war was unlike anything the world had seen, industrialized, total, and merciless, fought with repeating rifles, ironclad warships, and telegraph communications. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 transformed the conflict from a war to preserve the Union into a war to end slavery, and made it impossible for Britain or France to support the Confederacy without appearing to support slavery itself. The turning point came at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in July 1863. 3 days of fighting that left 50,000 men dead, wounded, or missing. The Confederate advance into the North was stopped. The initiative passed to the Union and never returned. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. 5 days later, Lincoln was shot while attending the theater. He did not live to see the 13th Amendment abolish slavery throughout the United States, but it was ratified that December. The wound was not healed. It would not be healed for generations. But it was named. A power rises. The decades following the Civil War saw the United States transform with almost frightening speed. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed. Steel cities rose in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Immigrants arrived by the millions from Ireland, Italy, Poland, China, Russia, pouring through Ellis Island with almost nothing and building almost everything. The Spanish-American War of 1898 announced American ambitions on the world stage. When the battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, the cause still disputed, the United States declared war on Spain and emerged with Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. President Theodore Roosevelt's big stick foreign policy made clear that the Western Hemisphere was now an American sphere of influence. When the First World War erupted in Europe in 1914, America initially stayed out. It had 2 oceans for protection and little appetite for European quarrels. But German submarines sank American ships. Then a German telegram was intercepted, proposing that Mexico invade the United States in exchange for German support. In April 1917, Congress declared war. American troops arrived in France exhausted by years of trench warfare that had already killed millions. Fresh, enthusiastic, and arriving in enormous numbers, they helped tip the balance. The war ended in November 1918. Over 100,000 Americans had died. Boom, bust, and World War again. The 1920s roared. Jazz music poured out of New Orleans and Chicago. Hollywood became a dream factory. The Model T put the average American behind a wheel. Women won the right to vote. And then, in October 1929, the stock market collapsed. The Great Depression ground the economy to dust for a decade. Recovery came, brutally and completely, through another war. On December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The following day, President Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress and declared it, a date which will live in infamy. The United States entered the Second World War. For the next 4 years, American factories ran 24 hours a day. American soldiers fought in North Africa, Sicily, France, the Pacific Islands, and the Philippines. More than 400,000 Americans died. The war also produced the most terrible weapon in human history. Scientists from Germany, many of them Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution, warned American officials that Germany might be developing an atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project was launched in secret. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second fell on Nagasaki. More than 100,000 civilians died immediately. Japan surrendered. The war was over. The world would never feel entirely safe again. Cold War and the space race. The peace that followed World War II was no peace at all. It was a frozen standoff between two superpowers armed with weapons capable of ending civilization. The United States and the Soviet Union agreed on almost nothing except that nuclear war would be mutual suicide. Between that shared understanding, they competed everywhere else. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Latin America, in Africa, fighting each other through proxies, through espionage, through propaganda, and through science. The space race was the competition at its most spectacular. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first satellite, and the beep of its radio transmitter, audible to anyone with a shortwave receiver, carried a message that terrified Washington. We got here first. NASA was founded the following year in direct response. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped off the lunar module Eagle and onto the surface of the moon. One small step for man, he said, one giant leap for mankind. It remains perhaps the greatest single achievement in the history of human exploration. Meanwhile, at home, another revolution was unfolding. Quieter in some ways, louder in others. African Americans, denied the basic rights the Constitution had promised for a century, demanded equality. Martin Luther King Jr. led marches, sit-ins, and boycotts across the South, facing fire hoses and police batons with deliberate nonviolence. His 1963 speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, "I Have a Dream," gave voice to a vision of America that had never quite existed, but had never quite died either. Into the modern world. The Cold War ended, not with a bang, but with a wall coming down. The Berlin Wall, in November 1989, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union 2 years later. The United States stood, briefly, as the world's sole superpower. Then came September 11th, 2001. On a clear Tuesday morning, 19 men hijacked 4 commercial aircraft. 2 were flown into the World Trade Center in New York. 1 struck the Pentagon. The 4th, its passengers having learned what was happening and decided to fight back, crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 people died. The attacks triggered 2 decades of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, reshaped American politics and security policy, and left marks on the national psyche that have not faded. Today, the United States remains the largest economy on Earth. Its military is without equal. Its universities draw scholars from every country. Its cultural exports, film, music, technology, have saturated the world. Companies born in California garages have become some of the most powerful institutions in human history. But the deeper story of America has always been the tension between what it declares and what it does. Between the promise of those opening words and the reality of the people left out of them, that tension has never been fully resolved. Perhaps it never will be. Perhaps the resolution is not a destination, but the argument itself. The ongoing, unfinished, sometimes brutal, sometimes magnificent argument about who America is and who it ought to become. That argument began before the ink on the Declaration was dry. It continues today.